different from what I have done publicly among the general public when I'm asked to say a few words about this submarine Viperfish and what was done, because you are all submariners. And I feel like I'm in very, very good company with all of you here, just in consideration of what you all have done for our country and what I'm able to do now in speaking as one submariner to another. I'm talking to people who know the challenges, who have taken the risks, who have made the contributions for the benefit of our country. And I thank you for that. And I appreciate your service for our country, all of you. This story is going to be just a story of one man aboard one submarine and working with one submarine crew and working to accomplish a virtually impossible mission that had never been done before. This starts out then back in the early times, which some of you might identify with, when I was in the process of flunking out of junior college and basically performing abysmally in everything academic. I ended up being brought into the recruiter by my dad, and talking with him revealed a mission he had to bring me into an arena that would turn me into a nuclear star, is what he called it. He said, it's guaranteed you will be a nuclear star when we're finished with you. Well, that sounded pretty exciting, especially compared to philosophy classes in junior college. And so I became driven by some visions. This is the kind of vision that you can see from the American Submariner magazine. And if you can show slide 2, you'll see another vision I had. The following things on the surface with the intensity of periscope monitoring and all of that. This was a part of the excitement as I was looking to take the plunge and join the Navy. But I wanted to be on a first-class, high-speed, sleek and smooth submarine. So slide 3 will give you an idea of what I was looking at for that. This would be an SSN. This would be a fast thing that would go out in the ocean and do many things that were exciting. So this was my vision as I went into boot camp and then ended up in ETA school up in San Francisco on Treasure Island, nuclear power school at Bainbridge, reactor prototype training up at the Congamon Lakes in Connecticut, and finally down to New London for submarine school over a span of 3 years. These visions were in my mind. And so we were given the dream sheet, as you all have received at the completion of training. And on the dream sheet, I put down I wanted an SSN. I want to be on a fast attack nuclear submarine. And so I received a set of orders then to Hawaii, which I was happy about, to take me out of the clouds of New London to the beautiful Hawaiian waters where there were beautiful girls and nice weather, and it sounded great. And I would be ordered to report aboard the USS Viperfish. Well, I had never heard of the Viperfish. And I had seen enough in submarine school and during the nuclear training and everything to get a sense of all the submarines in the Navy, but I had never heard of it. So I asked around to some of the chiefs, and nobody there ever heard of it. Of course, this is pre-computer, pre-Google time. So I had to go to the submarine library to the Jane's Book of Fighting Ships. And I looked it up. What does this sleek SSN actually do? So if you show slide 4, you'll see the first picture I saw. This is what was on display as my future home, which was probably one of the biggest, ugliest, nastiest looking things I'd ever seen, far removed from the sleek and fast thing I had in my dreams, but it looked like it might be functional. You can move over to slide 5, you'll see another picture. And I discovered the thing had these missiles on it with wings. And this is pre-Polaris time, when missiles out in the ocean were something that were very unique and very important in the defense of our country. So it turned out the Viperfish fires these missiles. I said, well, what is it doing now? It's been back into dry dock again. So it turned out that the dry dock story was construction back in the 1950s with a submarine that had no nuclear reactor. It was a conventional submarine as they built it. And as they got going with it, the Nautilus was creating its own legend. And they stopped and they decided to put another compartment in it, which as a nuclear reactor operator was a fortunate thing, as from my viewpoint. They decided to put a nuclear reactor into this conventional submarine. So when I looked closer at the pictures, show slide 6, it showed this thing firing another missile, and it has bow planes. You see the bow planes. I never heard of an SSN with bow planes. This is probably the strangest submarine I've ever seen, and its sail is so short. So finally moved over to slide number 6. And this is what the thing looked like at sea. Well, this was a little bit inspiring because this thing looks like it's ready for action. But this was the earlier picture before they changed it. When I reported aboard, this thing that was clearly the ugliest submarine I've ever seen, that fired Regulus missiles, but wait, coming out of dry dock, it doesn't do that anymore. And now they've decided to put in a nuclear reactor. So what does it do now? Does it hunt Soviet submarines? Does it do anything exciting that would make it inspirational to serve aboard? So here it was, and I got the orders to go, and so I went. I ended up coming aboard. They signed me on board. I got my qual card. I got my rack assignment, and I started asking around, what does the viperfish do? Amazingly, nobody knew. I said, well, it's got to be doing something. What are we gearing up to do? And they said, oh no, it's classified. It's completely classified. It's code word only classified. It is secret, and we'll let you know when you need to know, and the need to know is what counts. So I began the process of removing my designation, which was that of a non-qual puke, and beginning the lessons to learn everything I could about the boat. And along the way, we had some interesting visitors. Slide 7 shows I'm standing behind Elvis Presley here as he came aboard. This is back when he was young and slender, but I wasn't admiring Elvis so much as I was admiring who was with him. You show slide 8. This was Priscilla. And you'll notice she's not smiling and she doesn't look too happy because she's wearing a dress, and she discovered all the men in the working on the superstructure were down below the superstructure, which has holes in it that can look up. And to get on the boat, she would have to climb down the ladder, and there was a whole group of men very willing and ready to help her down and do anything else they could to help. So she exited the boat and went back to her limousine, but Elvis was fabulous. He came aboard. He said, this is just like being in an army tank back when I was in the army. As you can recall, he was an enlisted man in the army. He came down in the control center. You show the next slide. We can see what we all gathered around him, and he signed a lot of autographs. So it seemed like we were getting involved with some interesting people who had interesting backgrounds, and this was clearly going to be an interesting submarine. I looked at the various elements of the submarine as we continued the process of qualifications, and I discovered that there was only one way to get out of the submarine, and that would be through the escape hatch, which conveniently was located in the bow compartment, which was where Bill Berry hung out most of the time. The bow compartment was where all those missiles were stored that had been removed. And it was such a big compartment that, unlike most submarine design criteria, where if any compartment floods, the submarine can still surface, can still generate enough buoyancy. If the bow compartment floods, it goes down. There's no way around it. But that's where the escape chamber was located. So that seemed a little bit contrary, and the men in the bow compartment were feeling a little bit smug because they had that escape chamber sitting right there, until they noted that the depth of the ocean out there was about 20,000 feet, which was about 15 times our crush depth, and it would not be doing them much good. So the whole object of this was, don't let it go down for any reason, and don't count on an escape chamber to escape you out of the submarine. And so we went out to sea after the dry dock was done and we finished deperming and degaussing and removing the magnetic signature of the boat. And we dove with the Hawaiian shipyard workers roaming the boat with flashlights. The one MC announced at 300 feet, search for leaks. Everybody with flashlights searched. And then 10 minutes later, we're now at 400 feet, all hands search for leaks. And this continued all the way down until they announced rig ship for deep submergence. And then after that, we're now at test depth, all hands look for leaks. And that was when I became really aware of the feeling of risk and of the challenge and of what submarine duty was all about in terms of hazard and trying to lead us to accomplishments while we were doing the jobs we were trained to do. So the testing of things began. We tested all the equipment through the boat. We found that it worked relatively well, but things were becoming increasingly serious as the Cold War was intensifying. You can move over to slide 11. These were the kinds of people that were out there. Slide 12 shows another one. And then slide 13 is going to be the one that I'm not going to say much about, although slide 13 shows a submarine called the K-129, which is a conventional Soviet submarine that fires nuclear missiles. And it fires them right up out of that, whatever that thing is, sail or conning tower, whatever that center structure is. 3 of them, and they are nuclear tipped, so they are very, very dangerous. And this was a very, very dangerous submarine. And it was on patrol in the Pacific when we went out there. We trained for steam leaks. Slide 14 will show what that looks like. This is inside of our tunnel. This is me in a steam suit with our revered hospital corpsman standing nearby. He was very important later on as we went out there, but he's just a great man, functioning as a doctor most of the time. I can't say enough good things about him. So this was in the tunnel over the top of the nuclear reactor. We became increasingly trusting of each other as we function as an increasingly tight and capable crew. If you take a look at slide 15, you get a sense of what these men were like. This is the point where I became drawn to the camaraderie that is inherent with submarine duty. And all of you know about this. These are the people you trust when you're asleep. These are the people you trust when things are going badly. These are the people you trust to fulfill the missions. So in the middle of all of this, while I'm still a non-qual puke, we transited over to the West Coast. We went up to Bremerton, down to San Francisco, back to Hawaii. And then we went to the island of Maui, which was advertised as the place we could go where there were beautiful beaches and beautiful girls just waiting for us. They were all looking for men. So I was pretty excited about that. Slide 16 shows what things looked like when we got there, shortly after qualifications were completed. And if you can show the next slide, it shows me standing on the deck of the Viperfish off the coast of Maui. Because the first thing that nukes learn when you get qualified as a nuke on a submarine is the shore power cables do not extend 1.5 miles out to sea. So when you're sitting out there, you've got to have a nuclear reactor running. And if a reactor is going to be running, you've got to have nuclear reactor operators and electricians and all the machinists mate nukes. And they got to be in the engine room doing the job to keep the submarine functioning. So the expression on my face pretty much summarizes the circumstances, which at that moment consisted of bikini-clad women on catamarans circling the submarine, and the girls were calling out, "Sailor, sailor," and many other things, while we were locked onto the boat, and the rest of the crew was ashore having a good time. That was the end of that. So by that time, as I had finally become qualified and I was a reactor operator and I was an SS finally, I asked again, what exactly is the Viperfish doing? Because clearly it had a system that could exit the bottom of the submarine and on a cable that was very, very, very long, go down to great depths and search the bottom of the ocean. And I was told once again, it's classified. Everything about it is classified. And then the mantra came forth, which I'm going to read to you, which I think most of you may have heard, but this explains why it's called the silent service. On my submarine, we did some of the stuff we did, but because it was secret, we didn't really do it, even though we did, but not really. Those medals my shipmates and I received were for doing what we didn't do, except that I really didn't get the medals that they gave me. We never went where we were, and we weren't there where we were doing the stuff that we didn't do while we were there not doing it. As far as what boat I was on, I won't mention the Viperfish, since that is not its real name. And in fact, the Viperfish was the submarine I was never on doing what I never did. I hope this clarifies things so you can all understand it better, but beyond it all, I was a submariner, and that was for sure. Well, suddenly things became very intense and very serious. Items began to break through the boat as we continued with our weeks and then our months of prolonged searching patrols. We suddenly brought aboard a whole gathering of civilians, which is pretty unusual for a submarine. And there were departure ceremonies and departure speeches, and everything became ever increasingly intense. We headed out to sea again, hundreds of miles and then thousands of miles. We dove very deeply, and we began searching the bottom of the sea in a very, very serious manner. We knew during that time the Soviets were looking for us. There were pings, there were searching sonar systems going off. There were occasional explosions from sounding devices seemingly far away. Under the thermal layers we remained, and we continued searching. And then we came back to port again. From Papa Hotel to Papa Hotel was our mission. Pearl Harbor, of course, being the Papa Hotel component. And during all this time, nobody in the crew had any idea what we were doing. I'm not sure how much Bill Barry knew of anything here, but I'll let him tell you in his own words. Things began happening, and increasingly dangerously so. At night, while I was sound asleep in my rack, off watch, a column of water came flooding out through the ventilation duct, blew me out of the rack. As I hit the deck in the rig for red dark cruise sleeping area, I heard the 1MC announce flooding, flooding, flooding. I saw all down the passageways the other men jumping out of their racks as columns of water came out through the ventilation system. The thought we had as we stood there in the water that was accumulating in the dark was that we were either going to drown shortly, or the submarine would collapse, or we would die from chlorine gas inhalation because the battery was right there where the seawater was coming in, and the chloride and the sodium chloride of the salt would be converted over to chlorine gas, which is toxic and will kill you. In the meantime, the 1MC was hauling surface, 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 and we tried to get up to the surface. The boat was heavy from the water that came in. As it turned out, it came in because of a tiny, probably 1.5 inch long sensing probe in the snorkel mass, which broke off and amazingly wedged itself in the valve as the valve went shut when the next wave came over the snorkel. The main induction system sucked in thousands of gallons of water, blowing it all through the boat and making us very heavy, driving us deep, which suctioned in more water before the ballast control panel operator could take action to shut the thing off. So, which he finally was able to do. And then finally the words came out to all of us standing there in our skivvies in that darkened room with our feet up to the ankles in water. Now surface, 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 all hands, clean up the ship, which we did, and then we moved on. More things broke then, things with the nuclear reactor. While I was sitting there in front of the panel, the reactor suddenly shut down. It just went into its automatic shutdown system, the details of which are, I'm sure, still highly classified, but it did shut down. We had no power. As soon as there was no power, of course, the turbines trip off the line, the steam pressure goes down. The lights will go out, and half of the lights go out. And so we go up to the snorkel depth. We start off the diesel, and then I restarted the reactor and brought things back on the line again with the rod level indicators showing we were back to the critical state again where it ran. And then it happened again. By that time, the captain was back in the maneuvering area asking what's going on. We said we have no indication. The memory lights are not showing why it shut down. And I brought it back up again a second time. So we continued snorkeling while the reactor was running, and then it did it a third time. But this time, instead of driving the rods partly down, it drove them further down and further down. And it was clear I had no control of this reactor that was just completely shutting itself down. As we were all standing, and I yelled permission to scram the reactor, which means you open the circuit breakers and drop all the control rods to the bottom. And the engineering officer agreed. I turned the huge scram switch, and that slammed down the entire system. We were totally shut down. And then we were lying on the surface as we all began to troubleshoot the problem. So we moved along for the next several hours on the surface as the boat was rolling and the engine room heated up to 110 to 120 degrees, with the men puking because of the rolling activities, tearing apart the drawers that held the capacitors, the resistors, and all of the transistors, with the captain sitting on the steps watching us. 9 hours later, we identified the 58-cent diode that had failed, creating a false shutdown signal in such a way that never allowed anybody to identify what it was that made it go down. We pulled out that diode, we replaced it, and I started the reactor back up again. 5 days later, after months at sea, as we were sitting there having our cream of wheat cereal and the morale was down in the bucket at the bottom of the ship at the bilges, one of the enlisted men suddenly regurgitated everything that he had eaten from breakfast onto the table in front of us. We all jumped back and said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "There's worms in the cereal." We all took a look into the cream of wheat and discovered these tiny white worms crawling around. And immediately the entire crew hurled everything they had in their mouths. And everybody started screaming and yelling. The cook came out, and then he said the worst thing anybody could ever say in that circumstance. He said, "Come on, guys, I'm doing the best I can." Well, that was not the right thing to say. And that comment, "doing the best I can," was repeated probably 100,000 times during the rest of that miserable patrol before we finally came back to Papa Hotel. So he got off the boat and non-qualified after that was the end of him. We haven't seen him since. So we headed back out thousands of miles again from Hawaii. We heard the muffled explosions in the waters as we tried to continue searching. And then the searching systems broke. Several times it broke. The cables jammed, bound up the searching fish device, locking up our searching ability. We lost one of the fish, these multi-million-dollar fish devices that could search so well. Week after week went by out there, month after month went by, until in the middle of all this, the families of another fast attack submarine, the Uss Scorpion, came to the pier to welcome their loved ones on their returning submarine, which never returned, with 99 men dead at the bottom of the sea. Our own hull number was only a couple of numbers from theirs. 589 was the numbers for the Scorpion, and those 99 men were lost forever. A couple of weeks later, we returned back out for another prolonged submerged cruise to the searching site, and 2 very long months later, we suddenly had another emergency. If you could show slide 18. This is how things look. This is not an exact picture of what the ocean was doing, but this is what it was doing. And I think any of you who've been on the surface during a major hurricane situation would have an idea what this was all about. and we were down deep where we were safe. I remember calling up to the control center and saying, how deep are we? Because I could feel the movement of our boat. And he said, we're currently at about 450 feet, but we were rolling with these waves. That was pretty bad stuff. When got off watch, I went into my rack. I was sound asleep when I could feel the boat suddenly lurch in a downward direction. As it went down about 20-degree down angle, it didn't re-level itself. It didn't do anything other than continue with this down angle. With this huge storm on the surface, they saw we were going deeper. The ballast control panel operator lightened the boat. We came up, we almost broached, and then we went down and dropped down to nearly our test depth. And this was back and forth in the ocean from nearly broaching to nearly being excessively deep, as they diagnosed the problem being the bow plane's hydraulic system had developed a lock which locked them in the full down position, giving the boat a good 20-degree down angle, which is not a safe situation, obviously. They decided that the danger to the submarine, the danger to the crew, outweighed the danger to a crew member who might be able to latch onto the railing on the superstructure to slide across the railing and reach down with a wrench to unlock the hydraulic seal that had failed the bow planes. And so Chief Charlie and another man both had volunteered to do this. They climbed up the sail. The last thing that was done to Chief Charlie's life vest was one of the enlisted men reached over and flipped on his light, which he had not turned on. They climbed up through the hatch. As up on the top of the sail, the lookouts were watching out into the dark with the OD, and they latched onto the railing, began dragging their attachments along the railing up toward what we call the bat cave, which was that huge hump in the front of the boat, so they could free up the hydraulic lock. Right about that time, a rogue wave approached the front of the boat. The wave we later estimated had to be more than 70 feet high because it went over the top of the sail. The two men began running back to the sail to get into the sail before the wave hit, because it took about 10 to 15 seconds in its approach to get close enough to be an immediate danger. One of the men jumped into the sail. Chief Charlie tried to get in right when the wave hit. Suddenly he was 70 feet underwater and accelerated back toward the screws. The water cleared away, and I heard down in the control room where I was standing with a man overboard bag, I heard them yell, man overboard, man overboard. Somebody yelled, who was it, who was it? Somebody else yelled, it doesn't matter, he's gone. So the captain and Gary Smith, who was the engineering officer and also the officer of the watch at the time, took over the scopes, rotating around as we put on a full back emergency bell to try to stop the boat as we accelerated a quarter of a mile and then maybe even a half a mile and perhaps more away from where the Chief Charlie had gone in. The maneuvering room called up that we're exceeding the oil temperatures on the backing bell, which was designed to handle only about 30 seconds of full emergency back. He yelled, keep your bell on, keep your bell on. We slowed, we turned, they rotated the scopes looking out into the night as the boat rolled. And then almost as a miracle, there was a quick flash of a light that went across the periscope vision system for Gary Smith. He yelled the location, he hit the marker that showed where it was relative to where our submarine was. And we continued the rotation as the waves were broadsiding us and lined up for where that light flash had been seen. And then in one of the bravest actions I've ever seen, one of the control room crew members scrambled up the ladder, exited the hatch and the sail with a line around his waist, and 2 minutes later, a severely hypothermic Chief Charlie was lowered headfirst down through the control room hatch. followed quickly thereafter by the enlisted man. He was crying and sobbing. He said, I never saw the boat. I never saw the boat. The doc gave Charlie some warming fluids, wrapped him up. We cheered his return and celebrated his time on liberty. He remained very quiet through the remainder of the time at sea. And with everybody back aboard again, the control room hatch was shut. We dove and we spent 2 days going up and down with the failed bow planes, controlling our depth with the speed and the ballast balance as the bow planes remained locked. We finally returned back to Pearl Harbor, where Chief Charlie non-volunteered from submarines. He divorced his wife. He has never been seen again, and nobody knows where to find him. He's not come to any of our reunions, as far as I know. Bill Berry could comment on that, I guess. The next time we headed back out to sea again, continuing doing whatever it was we were doing since nobody knew, the morale plummeted more and more. Critical equipment kept breaking. And after about 6 more weeks of searching and failing and searching and failing, I was at the reactor control panel talking with Jackson, the electrician sitting next to me, watching his electrical panel. We were both depressed, but he started talking endlessly with what I later learned in medicine is called pressured speech pattern, where he would talk longer than was appropriate. We would tell him to stop talking and he would just smile and say, you can't get to me. And he would start talking again. In the middle of this, the 7 AMC speaker suddenly blared out, flooding, flooding, lower level engine room, and half the lights in the engine room went out. Circuit breakers popped open. The 1MC blared out, emergency surface, emergency surface. And that was when Jackson suddenly stood up in front of his panel and screamed that God was inside his soul. He abandoned the EPCP, running down the upper level engine room with 2 chiefs chasing after him, where he was finally caught by the forward watertight door. The cross-training of submariners became critically obvious as to how important it was as the throttle man jumped up into the EPCP position, taking over the electrical panel operations. The upper level engine room watch jumped into the throttle position. And we finally broke the surface with Jackson fully psychotic and curled up in a ball by the forward watertight door. The 1MC announced, now secure from flooding drill. It was all a drill. We returned to Papa Hotel. They put Jackson still in his straitjacket into an ambulance in front of his wife and 2 daughters. And the ambulance departed with him to Tripler Army Hospital. The next day I visited Jackson. He was continuously floridly psychotic in a room filled with Marines coming back from Vietnam who were also psychotic, and he was being processed for a psychiatric discharge. I left the hospital, I went to the airport, and I flew to California, where my bride, Keiko, had just obtained her master's degree at USC. And she was there waiting for me. If you can show slide 19, we were married 2 days later, followed by 2 weeks of a glorious honeymoon. The experience could not contrast more greatly with what we have just been through of transitioning from being in hell to going straight up to heaven for that 2 weeks. It lasted for that time from Jackson and his psychosis to flooding that wasn't happening, with endless, fruitless, unfruitful hunting fish, rocks, and looking at the bottom of the ocean, to a marriage and a honeymoon. Finally resulted in the 2 of us flying back to Hawaii. I found an apartment for Keiko. I returned to the Viperfish at 1 a.m. to start the reactor up again. For the final 2 months of power remaining in the reactor, which was becoming depleted before it would be at the end of its life. I was doing the reactor pre-critical checkoffs at about 2 a.m. And we had 1 machinist mate in the engine room doing his pre-turbine operations activities. The 2 of us working hard to get things going so that we could be bringing steam in the engine room at 0600 hours or light off the turbines, and be ready to go at 0700 hours. As I finished doing the pre-critical checks, the final action was to close the scram breakers, which latches the control rods. Scram breaker 1 was closed and it made a resounding clunk, locking in the control rods for control. Scram breaker 2 did the same thing. Scram breaker 3, the last one, when I closed it, I could hear the tinkling sound of broken machinery dropping down inside the circuit breaker system. It would not latch the control rods, it would not lock them in. There was no way it was going to work, and there would be no way to control the reactor or to take the reactor up on the line. So I looked around, I was all alone in the engine room, and I made a decision. Open up the circuit breaker, turn off the high voltage connecting to everything, shine in the flashlight and identify what that sound was. It was from a tiny strip of metal, about a ½ inch wide and 4 inches long, that was a part of the tripping mechanism for tripping the circuit breaker open from the reactor control panel, 50 yards astern from that position. I looked around, realizing with that tripping mechanism gone, there's no way that reactor can have its control rods latched. But there was a Coca-Cola can sitting on the shelf nearby. And 10 minutes later, a strip of metal that was identical in size to the previous tripping strip that came off was inserted into the scram breaker. It was a perfect identical strip. I turned on the high voltage, I slammed the circuit breaker shut, all the rods latched, it worked perfectly. I pulled the control rods, we got steam in the engine room, and at 0700 hours, we were on our way out of Papa Hotel for the final search. More things broke, things went badly again. We couldn't find anything. We didn't know what we were looking for. There were more worms in the cereal. It became increasingly challenging. And then the final blow was the cable reel broke and our searching system in the quest came to a halt once again. The captain announced the problem. He said, we have a little more than 2 weeks left before the reactor becomes depleted, but we're going to stay until we fix the cable and fix the reel. Everybody think. The crew stood down for a week with everybody working and thinking and working. The reactor operator and electricians and the engine room kept the reactor going at a low power level. And then this engineman came into the captain's stateroom and said, sir, I think I can fix the problem. He explained an ingenious system of leverage and real alterations. He showed the captain the drawings. The captain said, you have a green light, give it a try. He followed the plan. The reel and the cable began working again. The fish went down thousands of feet, and astoundingly, as it got close to the bottom of the ocean and the cameras started taking the pictures, it was directly over our top secret code word classified target that we had been searching for most of the past year. The 1MC announcement was made by the captain. I'm sure Bill remembers this. The voice shaking with intensity. He said, we have found what we've been looking for. We have found it at last. While we hovered over this target and took a total of 32,000 pictures, we feasted on a variety of items in a celebration. I'm not at liberty to discuss what those items were. And we spent the final 2 weeks documenting everything before heading home. Nobody asked what we had found. Everybody still had no clue what the target was and what we'd found, but we knew we had found it. Weeks later, as we were steaming up the Pearl Harbor Channel, I was controlling the reactor. I turned to the engineering officer of the watch and I said, sir, I would like you to be aware of my repair with a strip of Coca-Cola can in the scram breaker tripping mechanism. And I suggested to him that we get a legal strip of metal before we pull the control rods up again. He swung around and stared at me with this astounded look in his eye for a remarkable period of time. You did what, Dunham? He finally hollered. You did what? He kept hollering the same thing over and over again. You did what? You put in a strip of metal from a Coca-Cola. Finally, he glared at me and he hollered, don't ever tell anybody that you did that. We entered Pearl Harbor and everybody said, what did we find out there? The answer was always the same: it's classified. As the captain was escorted to his waiting car, his thick briefcase handcuffed to his right arm with 32,000 high resolution photographs within, he disappeared in the direction of Washington, D.C. 20 years passed after that. I left the Navy. I became a straight A student, came out of UCLA. My wife and I arrived in Santa Barbara. 20 years later, I still had no idea what we had done. About this time, William Broad, who was a correspondent of the New York Times, suddenly broke the story on the front page. I finally knew what had happened, what we did, what we found. I wrote a book called Spy Sub. The Deep Submergence branch of the Pentagon sent 4 men out here to Santa Barbara, locked me in a room for 5.5 hours. We had an intense grilling session and a final clearance. And as soon as they were aware that I had no interest in revealing any secrets, but I wanted to tell about the men, what the challenge had been for the men and what the men had done to survive and get through this and find success, they cleared it, and Admiral McElroy at the Pentagon finally cleared it for publication by the Naval Institute Press. After the publication, I gathered together the identification of all the widows of the men who died on the Soviet submarine, seeing as how 99 men had died, the same as our own USS Scorpion. Recruited everybody I could find in the Viperfish crew, as well as our own wives, and found as many widows of the men who had died on our own Scorpion and Thresher submarines, with some of their children, and with Bill Barry included, of course. We all went to Russia. We went to St. Petersburg, if you could show slide 20, to something I had never heard of before. It's seen on slide 20. This is a remarkable church that is called the St. Nicholas Mariners Cathedral in St. Petersburg, where we conducted a ceremony, a grieving ceremony, where all of these wives that were scattered around Russia, who had lost their husbands, and all of the wives of the Americans that I could find that had lost their husbands, and our crew and our wives who were worried about losing us, we all gathered together. And now there's a plaque there. If you ever visit St. Petersburg, you should take a look at this plaque. It lists the name of the 99 men who died. And the bottom of the plaque says, "In loving memory of our brave submariners from Russia and the United States of America, who have sailed their final mission in dedicated service to their country, you are with us forever." That will be in perpetuity forever in that structure. Well, if you show slide 22, you'll get an idea of what was going on during that ceremony. 60 Minutes was filming it. And this was the crew up. This was the captain is the man on the right. I'm standing next to him. And off on the left side is Father Bogdan, the religious man. At that point, we had about 3 shots of vodka, which is what they normally do, apparently. And then there were the 2 Russian admirals that were admirals for the Soviet submarine navy. They were there in appreciation for recognizing the loss of the submariners and the effect on the family, which had scattered all over the country. We conducted a very solemn ceremony, and I was interrogated by the 60 Minutes crew. If you show the slide 22, you'll get an idea of this is Morley Safer interrogating me, and you can tell by his expression how much information I'm giving him. None. Basically, this was a classified mission, and it remained classified, even though we were celebrating the gathering together of the people in condolences for their losses. So they did do a 60 Minutes thing on it, a 20-minute production that was just a complete disaster from what I could tell. And Morley Safer spiraled off into, he didn't treat the widows very well at all from their reports. And so that was a real challenge. At that ceremony, if you go to slide 25, you will see a somewhat blurred out image of our wives. Oh, this is the presidential unit citation that we got. This is right after I left the Navy. And then Going over to slide 25, if you would. Is that the slide 25? Let me see where we are. Yeah, there it is. These are the wives that were with us and with the men. And then slide 26 shows the men who gathered, and standing in the front there with a tie was the commanding officer. To the left of him was Gary Smith. Gary Smith was the man who saved Chief Charlie from his nighttime loss at sea. Next to him was the chief of the reactor division who had been on the Nautilus. Next to the captain is me, and behind myself is another one of the reactor operators, Dickie Doo. And behind me on the right side, behind my right shoulder, is somebody we know as Bill Barry. So this is confirmation that Bill was there, and bringing together all of us in remembrance of the sailors who lost their lives in the submarine duty for their country. The Viperfish went on after the accomplishments that we made to further accomplish additional extremely classified activities in the oceans of our world at great risk and with great bravery from the men of the Silent Service. These are the men from the reunion, and this finally came together with a Spy Sub book that was published by the Naval Institute Press on slide 28. If you could show that. And that's the story behind what we did. Slide 27 will show the one of the recent gatherings we had, where you see the name of the submarine has been whited out, but these are the men that are left. Much as all of you here today, these are the men who remember what we did and what was accomplished and enjoy the tremendous camaraderie that is inherent to the submarine service.